Okay, here we are again. Welcome everybody to the Catholic Church in England. And this will be the last of the English Catholic Church talks. And then I'm going to Scotland, and then I'm going to Wales, and then I'm going to the Cornish people in Cornwall. So, and then I think I'll be done and have to get a new topic. But anyway, to recap, we started with the ancient Christianity. It's a church in England, so where we start is when we start seeing Christians, and we saw them with the Britons, the ancient Britons, otherwise known as the Celtic people. I think Celtic is Celtic, which people say Celtic, but I think the proper pronunciation is actually Celtic. But anyway, the kind of the centerpiece to just anchor it as the beginning of the discussion is King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Legendary, and probably was just legendary, probably never was King Arthur. However, there were certain chieftains that archaeologists are claiming may have been at least the basis of the legend. And that would be in Tintagel, otherwise known as Camelot, in Cornwall, on the north side of Cornwall, because Cornwall is a peninsula. And so on the north side, actually across the sea from Wales. So these people are all related, they're all Celtic people, as are the Scottish, all the way down to Brittany, which is in Europe. They're all the same people, even as far south as Celtic people in Spain, in northern Spain. They're all related. Have you ever heard of the Black Irish? Those are all Celtic people related to each other. And the darker complexion people are actually from Spain. So that's where you get Black Irish. So, but anyway, that story, of Camelot, Sir Lancelot and Gawain and Guinevere. Do you remember all of that? Actually, I remember when I was growing up and as a young adult, that used to be part of the comics in the newspapers. People who are old like me remember that this kind of idea of chivalry and knights in shining armor and all of that sort of thing takes people's imagination. But it was actually Arthur de Mont, which is Mallory, is one much later who wrote about King Arthur, and that's what British people think of as the Arthurian legend. However, everybody in England references King Arthur. It is part of their legends and so forth. So, but anyway, what I said that I was mistaken about, I didn't realize, is the Romans, because they're sometimes called the Romano Britons, because they were under Rome. As you know, Rome was stationed in, the soldiers were stationed, and the soldiers brought their families with them, and so they spread Christianity because some of them were Christians, but they were Christians even before the Romans, and they converted a good number of Anglo-Saxons as well. And so the next part of the story comes with Augustine sent by the Pope to convert the Anglo-Saxons. Well, the real story is when they try to convert the Anglo-Saxons, many of them are already Christians. And so, but there, and then I got to move on. I get hung up with kings and stuff. So then you get the Normans coming in, and William the Conqueror, and the Catholic Church was still very much strengthened by them, because even though they were lousy Christians, very brutal people, you see, William the Conqueror was really a Viking, Normans or Norsemen, and so he was pretty brutal, and he just had the blood of a warrior, and just wanted to hack people to death, and so, but they were also great churchmen, and they built great churches. And if you go to England to this day, the real great cathedrals in a Gothic style are all Norman churches, like Durham and York, and all this fantastic, and Canterbury, all these fantastic cathedrals are Norman churches. But they also established the clerics as Normans, as a way of controlling the country. So we get people like Lanfranc, who had been the abbot of the Bec, B-E-C, Bec Monastery, which is just across the waters from, it's in Normandy. So Bec was a very famous monastery that had great scholars. And so Lanfranc was a marvelous administrator, and followed by his student from Bec as well, St. Anselm of Canterbury as well. And Anselm was very famous for his ontological proof, and if you can figure it out, I'll give you a quarter. And that is, God can be proven to exist because God is that which is greater than which can be thought. What in the world does that mean? In other words, God is even greater than any. If you rack your brain for anything great, then God is greater than that. So, it doesn't do a thing for me, but he's famous for it. He's famous for it. So, and then we move on to another dynasty. See, the dynasty ended with Henry II because his mother, Matilda, married Geoffrey of Anjou. I remember Anjou because I think orange juice, Anjou. And, but, they wore a sprig of a herb in their cap, and there was the Plantagenets, and they ruled for 300 years. So brutal as well, but very Catholic, And so the church is doing well, and if you want to know how the church was operating before Henry VIII, there's a book out by Duffy. His name is Eamon Duffy, and it's called Stripping of the Altars. And actually, if you want to go to our little loan library, there's a copy of it in there, and you can either borrow it or you can take it and keep it, whatever you want to do. But I have to say, it's kind of long. It's an easy read, but it's kind of long. It's something like a couple thousand pages, but it's really interesting if you really want. Because Henry VIII, then, who was himself a very devout Catholic, even went to the Marian shrine of Walsingham to walk barefoot in the snow several times when he was a young man, then because of his divorce. And we won't go into all of that because I've explained that a lot before. He wanted a dispensation from the Pope in order to actually divorce Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, who had been the widow of his brother Arthur. The Rome wouldn't give him a dispensation because he already received a dispensation to marry her in the first place, because it was relative family. So he wanted a dispensation from a dispensation. And Rome said, no, too much. I know you're the king, but you have to follow the rules. He wouldn't have it any other way than his way. And so he removed England from Rome influence and established his own church so that he could give himself a dispensation. And he did. So he could marry Catherine of Aragon. And then went on for 6 more wives, or 6 wives in total, a couple of whom he had beheaded. And so he was a really awful person, and the church began to become persecuted. And Henry then, after Bishop Fisher of Rochester and Thomas More refused to sign, a loyalty clause that they supported Henry in his divorce proceedings. They were both executed, followed by the Carthusians of London, and that set the ball rolling for Henry to close all the monasteries, close them down, murder the monks sometimes or scabbard them, and pull all of the great monasteries down. Beautiful buildings, all ruled by Henry VIII throughout the entire empire, including Walsingham, where he had made his pilgrimage, his Marian pilgrimage. He had that destroyed as well. As there's an image of Our Lady of Walsingham, which is sort of like a Celtic queen, and he took that to London and had it burned. And so he was pretty destructive God. So, but then after Henry VIII died from his many accidents of jousting, and the fact that he weighed over 400 pounds, because he was a big fat slob, is what he was, and a spoiled brat, then, and actually this is real interesting. When he was buried, the gases in his putrefying body burst, his casket exploded, and the church was filled with a terrible stench. But that wasn't unusual. Most people were buried in those days. Their caskets exploded. As a matter of fact, even Elizabeth had ordered that she not be embalmed, but they embalmed her anyway. And the reason for that is they wanted to reduce the strength of the explosion when the casket blew up. And these are wooden caskets with lead on them. And the thing about kings is once they were out of power, once a king, the kings of England through their whole history were brutal. They had to be, because if they showed any sign of weakness, then the aristocracy would rise up against them, and after they died, there was trouble. They had to replace. That's why having an heir was very important. And see, the Pope had come out with you had to be a legitimate heir, because before that, children born out of wedlock were also considered. But Henry the First, who was a Norman, he was very prolific in having children, but not so much in legitimate children. He had 29 illegitimate children. So that guy was a go-getter, so to speak. But it wasn't allowed, and you know that story that he only had one son, William, who was drowned in the White Ship catastrophe. And then that was the end of the Norman line with that. So, and then the whole story of, I like to at least remember her, Matilda, who had married a German prince and became an empress on the continent. Her husband died and she came back, and she had to fight for her throne and her crown, and she never did get it. She was fighting her cousin, Stephen. And so there was a treaty in which her cousin was allowed to stay on the throne, and then her son, Henry II, could be the next king. That was what he decided. And of course, Stephen didn't last hardly at all after that. Some wonder if maybe she had a hand in that as well. But anyway, that's a bit of the royalty. I'm going to stay away from royals. That was the end of the Tudors, and then the next line was the Stuarts. But they didn't have a Catholic king until actually James II. And you might have heard of the Jacobite rebellion, because many people wanted a Catholic on the throne, and he was a Catholic, but it was put down by the Whigs in Parliament and the Tories. Put it down and established raised up a revolution against the Catholic rule, and they won. They called it the Glorious Revolution, but it wasn't so glorious. And after that, they started uh, adding more and more anti-Catholic laws that Catholics, for all practical purposes, had lost all of their civil rights completely, so, especially in Iowa. And so it takes it up to the 1900s was then a change in art. They didn't want to follow the French Revolution in their anti-Catholic sentiments. Like the French had had the revolution and then the time of the terror, and it was such a bloodbath. Even Thomas Jefferson was for, because he was Protestant, for the revolution initially, but it became so dreadful that he was against it as well. And so, but anyway, then Catholics were excluded from serving in the military, but then England needed soldiers, and so they had to revise the laws. And then a lot of people, the church's numbers kept increasing to the point that they had to recognize that Catholics were significant numbers in the country. And as a result, then they revised the law, and it was the Catholic Emancipation Law in 1829. And that's when Catholics began to be treated better. And then, of course, there's still a lot of anti-Catholicism in England, even to this day, because, that propaganda has been around for a long time. And there are many British still don't like Catholics. But most of the laws against Catholics are off the books, as far as I know. First of all, if you're a Catholic, you cannot be part of the royal family. And part of that is because the sovereign is the head of the Church of England. So it wouldn't do very well for a Catholic to be the head of the Church of England. But I understand the Chancellor of England has to be Protestant. And oddly enough, the ambassador to the Holy See has to be a Protestant for some reason. Those English, And so, but anyway, a lot of people began to make, famous people began to make Catholicism more acceptable to the public, to the point that it became almost fashionable to convert to Catholicism for many British as well. And we get great, first of all, we start with Cardinal Newman, who was part of the Oxford movement, and a professor at Oxford who was very much respected for his intellect, and he written wonderful books, tomes. And if you think you're really smart, try to read some of those books and find out. A part of it is the language of the time, and part of it is very, very lofty thinker. But he gave the church a very good reputation for his theology. Followed by, I mentioned last time, Chesterton, who was such a sweetheart that everybody loved him, and he debated big issues in England at the time. But he did with such charity and such friendliness and sweetness that people would go, and thousands of people would go to his debates and were just charmed by him. And he wrote a lot of very important books like Everlasting Man, which is about Jesus, and Orthodoxy, which he wrote before he converted to Catholicism. And he's also famous for a lot of really interesting popular writings like the Father Brown series, the detective. He wrote those, and you can still see those on TV, on public television, and they'll put it based on the writings of G.K. Chesterton, still around. Another one who is not as sweet as Chesterton. Chesterton was a huge man, And I told the story when he visited the United States, they had to get the students to rock the car in order to bounce him out of there because he was so large, but very lovable. The other one is Hilaire Belloc, who was a devout Catholic who wrote a lot of history and pretty much showed that Catholicism was the truth. And as a matter of fact, he thought, and I think he was right, that Catholicism built Western civilization, and he felt that only Catholicism could save him. So, but he wrote a lot of popular things too. My favorites are the Cautionary Tales. I really love those. Probably considered not the best fare for children, but children love those stories. Um, One was Jim was always slipping away from his nurse. In those days, they hired people to be with the children. Uh, Probably because nobody else wanted to be with him. But anyway, Jim was always slipping away, and they would visit the zoo, and the lion got out, and the lion uh, got Jim, and he started with his toes, and ate his toes, and then his heels, and then his ankles, and just finished him off. And when the zookeeper found the lion finally, he scolded the lion and he said, spit it out. And it was the last glob of Jim that was left, and he spit it out, and it was his head. And they examined his head and discovered that Jim was dead. And his brother said, well, he just wouldn't follow the rules. So those are stories that they used to tell children in those days. They got the message. So I love them. I'll tell another one. One was that George was given an explosive balloon as a toy. He got it too close to a candle and it blew up, and it shook the house to the rafters, and the house went tumbling into the street. And George got a lump on his head because they said little boys should not be allowed to play with dangerous toys. So those are the kinds of things that Hilaire Belloc wrote. But there were others. Coming a little later was J.R.R. Tolkien, who surveys show that Tolkien is considered the best writer of all time. And, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are really great, masterful works. And another one I'll mention before I quit, and that is Frank Sheed, Sheed, wrote a lot of great books concerning Catholicism. And if you really want to come closer to Jesus, read his books. If you really want to be very much involved in the church, read Frank Sheed. His wife was Maisie Ward, and there's a publishing company. They established a Catholic publishing company in England, Sheed and Ward. It's still in existence, and you can get a lot of Catholic materials from that particular publishing company. They're online, but Frank Sheed's books are really great. To the extent that I'm thinking about the next class I do, might be from Frank Sheed. He's a wonderful writer, not only a very competent writer, but a great theologian. And he's British, so I thought I'd mention him as well. So some of the people that made, just a couple more things, the people who made Catholicism more acceptable, even more fashionable in England were like George, let me get his name, George Robinson. He had been the grand master of Masons, English Masons, but he left them to become a Catholic. he had been the viceroy of India, and then as a Catholic, he wrote very romantic books about the days of yore and Catholicism, and made Catholicism much more acceptable to the wealthy people. That contributed to uh, what became considered as Catholic architecture, Gothic. And the the building campaigns came slow. So there's in the continent, there are a lot of Romanesque churches. But before they started, by the time they started building in earnest, especially under the Normans, a Gothic became more popular and became identified with Catholicism. And as such, you'll find mostly Gothic churches in England, and not so much so on the continent. I mean, they're great Gothic churches, but there are also a lot of Romanesque churches as well. And so the architect for the Parliament building, for example, he was he built a Catholic building. Even in the interior, all the mosaics on the walls, everything are Catholic saints. So if you go to Parliament, you'll see a Catholic building in its completeness. And so those are the kinds of things. Not to mention so many Irish were coming in, and so many people coming back from the war, especially World War One, were impressed by the Catholic chaplains and decided to convert as well. And so the numbers of the Catholic Church grew exponentially, and everything looked like it was really good for Catholicism in England until Rome put out Vatican II documents. And it was the same as the United States. A lot of priests took the liberty. They think it was a free-for-all to introduce their own Catholic theology. And those were the years when priests and sisters left the church in large numbers. The same thing was happening in England. And so to this day now, and then Paul VI wrote Humanae Vitae, and that outraged people. And what he was saying is he was against birth control, artificial birth control. And people were saying, the Pope should stay out of our bedrooms, that sort of thing. And so there was a lot of rebellion. People wanted it their way. And so the church in the United States, I remember when I was young in the 50s, the church was hot. It was really going. We had Fulton J. Sheen on TV all the time, and it was really doing well. And people really respected the Catholic Church. And then all this other stuff caught up, and the same thing happened in England. So England has about 60 million people, and about 10% of them are Catholic now, which is about 6 million, which isn't bad. But of those 6 million, many people are lapsed Catholics. And it's even worse for the Church of England because only 2% of them, even though they're a much larger percentage of the population, but to be Church of England is to be English, so people are out of loyalty for their country. Only 2% of those folks go to church at all, and it's even declining more. So it's reaching the point where the Church of England really is to the point of closing their doors and shutting down parishes right now. So the Catholic Church is not doing that well in this country or elsewhere, but we have the benefit of so many immigrants coming in, especially from South America. More than half of all Catholics in the United States are Spanish speaking now, and that's growing. So demographics change, and the churches change. So I'm done with England now. Other than I'm going to go to Scotland. I'm going to pack my shillelagh, and I'm going to go to Scotland and talk about the church in Scotland, and from there I'm going to Wales, and then I'll go look at the Cornish people as well in Cornwall. and then I'll be done. And then I'll take up Frank Shee's books. Okay, are we done? Thank you very much for those few people who are still watching. Bye.